Hello and welcome to this edition of the Alaska Weather Show. Today is Tuesday, August 2nd, 2022, and I am meteorologist Carrie.haisley, Chief of the Emergency Services and Multimedia Branch for the National Weather Service in Anchorage. There are a couple of ways on your screen that you can get a hold of us if you are seeking weather information. The first is the Alaska Weather Information Line. Now keep in mind this number recently changed. The number is 1-855-937-4977. If you happen to still be using that old number, you get a recording that points you to this new number. That service will be turned off at the end of the week. The only way to reach the Alaska Weather Information Line now is that number there on your screen. Now you can find us on the web anytime at weather.gov/Alaska, and you can reach me via email anytime at carrie.haisley@noaa.gov. So next, let's take a look at our weather headlines, these given to us by our partners over at the Alaska Interagency Coordination Center. Those folks focus primarily on fire weather concerns and the weather going on and how that could impact fire potential. So we're looking today for some isolated wet thunderstorms for the interior, particularly the eastern interior. Actually, same places where we saw some thunderstorms yesterday. With those, some heavy downpours, even the potential for a little bit of hail. But that does keep our fire danger relatively low with the wetting rains that come with those, even though we could see some lightning strikes. We're looking for wetting rain potential across the southeast panhandle today, and also as we go through the next couple of days, keeping fire danger particularly low there. And then most of the fuels across the state are wet enough because we've been in a wet pattern that they're relatively resistant to new fire starts. That's a good thing. And looking out into the longer term, with a wet pattern coming into the next couple of days, it's possible that by weekend, most of our fuels could be just not favorable enough for fires to start, and fire weather season may actually be coming to an end. Now, a quick look at our fire potential here. This is the potential for tomorrow. Looking at all of our fuels across the state, focusing on the spruce. The greatest potential for any new starts is going to be over the upper Yukon Valley, where we do see an area there of high to very high potential based on that spruce. Now, if we're not really getting much in the way of lightning there, there's not going to be a lot to start fires. Most lightning that we expect is going to be a bit further to the south. Other fuels out across western mainland Alaska fall into that medium to just a little bit of high category. This isn't a place where we're really looking for thunderstorms, and it's a place where we're going to look for wetting rains over the next couple of days. So we'll take a look first at our satellite here and just kind of see what's going on today, and then we'll kind of translate that into what's going to be going on over the next few days. Again, potential for some of those thunderstorms to pop up over the eastern interior. We do see some clouds and some scattered showers on the satellite over parts of the interior today. Clouds have worked their way back into south central Alaska as well. And then out over the Aleutian chain, that's where we see kind of the next big weather maker that's going to bring a good bit of rain to part of mainland Alaska. That area of low pressure working its way from the North Pacific into the Bering Sea. So here's what that looks like on the surface chart. Area of low pressure about 1,000 millibars, so not particularly strong for this time of year, but definitely a wet system has crossed from the North Pacific into the southern Bering Sea, and the frontal boundaries associated with that will continue to work their way towards mainland Alaska as we go through the coming days. Now, one thing to call attention to, there's a cold front well offshore from the Arctic there, but we're going to keep an eye on that as we go through the coming days. That system is going to work its way a bit closer to mainland, and our Fairbanks office is concerned that we could see maybe some elevated surf with that. We're not looking for significant conditions when it comes to high surf there, but potential for at least some elevated surf associated with that particular system. Now, overnight tonight, shower potential lingers across a lot of mainland Alaska, that area of low pressure out over the Bering Sea. That system definitely sticks around and works its way closer to mainland. Wet conditions persist across the panhandle through the overnight hours. Continue to see see widespread rain in that particular area. Now for the day on Wednesday, that area of low pressure works its way even closer to mainland. The frontal boundaries reach mainland tomorrow, so we will see more in the way of rain spread its way into southwest mainland Alaska, particularly impacting areas around Bristol Bay and the YK Delta. Tomorrow, though, for mainland Alaska, once you get away from southwest, actually looks pretty good. We'll have some clouds lingering and the potential for some showers again to pop up around the eastern interior, but a lot of good sunny conditions for most places in mainland tomorrow. Fog up on the Arctic coast, and then we see that cold front push its way closer to the coastal areas there along the Arctic. That's where we're going to be watching for that elevated surf to start to develop. Showers do linger for the day on Wednesday down over the Panhandle. Into the day on Thursday, that area of low pressure pushes its way onshore, and then we see the frontal boundary push a bit further inland, so that should take most of those fire fuels that are out there that maybe have some potential for starting, get them good and wet, and it keeps our fire potential actually pretty low by the time we get into the day on Thursday. But a wet day across most of mainland Alaska, the Aleutians, and finally some improvement, however, for the folks down over the Panhandle. Now overnight tonight, we'll look for low temperatures across the southern part of the state to be primarily in the 40s and the 50s. And we could see with some sun tomorrow, some fairly warm temperatures, especially across south central Alaska. Temperatures getting up to about 75 around Talkeetna, 72 in the Anchorage area, and also down around Kenai. With the cloudiness and the rain, though, however, in the Panhandle, we'll look for their temperatures to be closer to 60. Now for Thursday morning, we do see some temperatures get back down into the 50s, maybe some 40s, upper 40s around, and not rebounding quite as much for the day on Tuesday, but we should see good enough weather for this particular area around south central that we could get near 70, definitely some upper 60s for the Anchorage area there. Down over the Panhandle, they'll see some more sun with some of that drying and some temperatures getting into the 60s for the day on Thursday. Now we'll head out west where temperatures also in the 40s to some low 50s across the state to start off your Wednesday morning, and then temperatures along the Aleutians staying in the 50s for most of the day tomorrow. A couple of 60s there right around Dutch Harbor. We'll see if they can get above 60, and then 60s across the southwestern part of mainland for most places. Right along the coast, though, temperatures hovering around 50. Now for the day on Thursday, we will stick around with our day, or well, we will see lows in the morning. Let's get this right here, around 50, some of the 40s. We're going to stick around on Thursday morning too, especially out along the Aleutians. And then as you get closer to the interior there, we'll see some temperatures around 50. Now, that frontal boundary pushing on shore on Thursday, that's going to keep the temperatures a lot cooler for the day on Thursday. Most places not getting much above 50 for mainland Alaska, and staying in the 50s for the day on Thursday out along the Aleutians. Up to the Arctic now, we're going to stay above freezing overnight tonight, but not by much for those sites up along the Arctic coast, some 40s into the mid 30s there. And then as you get further into the interior, overnight lows are going to be down into the 50s. Bouncing up into the 70s though for the upper Yukon Valley, also in the parts of the central interior, warming up into the 40s for a good portion of the Arctic coast there. We could even see a 60 there around Dead Horse tomorrow. They might get some sun that's going to cause that. Cooling back down though into the 40s for the day on Thursday, and then bouncing back into the 70s when we get into the afternoon hours. 77 for the high on Thursday afternoon in the upper Yukon Valley.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
So moving on to flying weather conditions for the state on Wednesday morning, we do see IFR dominating a lot of the weather across southwest mainland Alaska, parts of the Aleutian Chain and the Bering Sea there. That due to that area of low pressure that sits out there and the frontal boundaries associated with that will be pushing their way towards the western part of mainland Alaska as we get into the day on Wednesday. Some marginal VFR conditions possible tomorrow morning along the Alaska Range, also some lower conditions possibly up along the Arctic slope, and then marginal VFR conditions will dominate the weather for Wednesday morning down over the Panhandle, and we'll actually see that stick around in the Panhandle as we get into the day on Wednesday afternoon. Now, IFR does dominate the weather also over southwestern mainland Alaska for Wednesday. That frontal boundary associated with those lows, or that low out there in the Bering, that continues to push its way onshore, so we'll continue to see the low flying conditions with that. Also, we'll look for some fog and some stratus to persist along the Arctic coast as we go through the day on Wednesday. For most of mainland, though, it should be a pretty nice flying day on Wednesday. VFR and some sunny skies across a lot of south central and most of the interior. Now for the day on Thursday, we will look for marginal VFR conditions to linger down over the panhandle, and we'll continue to see some of that low pressure that's dominating the weather there linger, and showery conditions for that area there. IFR conditions, though, over parts of the Bering and also parts of the Alaska Peninsula, in Aleutian Chain, and then marginal VFR lingering out over southwest mainland with VFR over a lot of the rest of mainland Alaska. Conditions do deteriorate as we get into the Thursday afternoon time frame. We'll see IFR conditions work their way into Kodiak Island, also along the Alaska Peninsula, and up into the Bristol Bay region. We'll continue to see some deteriorating conditions there. IFR conditions also push on shore out over southwest mainland again, so they'll continue to stay pretty low over the next few days, and that with that center of the low pressure kind of pushing its way finally on shore. VFR, though, lingers into south central and into the eastern interior, at least through Thursday. Now, a quick look at our past conditions. We will look for Anaktuvik to be VFR tomorrow, although they could see some morning fog to start off the day. Same is going to be true for Adigan. Morning fog primarily going to be on the south side of those passes, but the actual pass should be prevailing VFR through the day. Rain will keep Chilkoot and White IFR tomorrow, and then as we get over to the Alaska Range passes, should be prevailing VFR. We could see some lower conditions just early in the day, but we will look for pretty good improvement with those passes. So as we get up to Rainy Pass, VFR conditions, same is going to be true for Windy Pass. Also going to see Isabel Pass and then Mentasta Pass VFR for the day tomorrow. Chance of showers developing along the Alaska Range, however, as we get into the afternoon hours tomorrow. Could actually see a few thunderstorms in that area, but not expected to take those passes down below VFR for long periods of time. Tanita Pass, same story, that chance of showers and maybe a few lightning strikes, but prevailing VFR. Then Portage Pass should be a great day to fly through that particular area. VFR conditions. Now a look at our freezing levels. Highest freezing levels are going to be out along the Aleutians, where we see them ranging from about 12,000 to 14,000 feet in some places. Up over mainland, pretty high freezing levels as well, between 8 and 10,000 feet. Not looking for much tomorrow in the way of icing over mainland Alaska. Again, we're going to be dealing with prevailing VFR most places. Greatest chance for icing is going to be along those frontal boundaries where we see the bulk of our moisture tomorrow, and the height on that's going to be pretty variable. When you get further west, the heights are going to be lower, the freezing levels are lower there. So above 8,000 feet for the Bering Sea, the far western Aleutians. I know we don't have a lot of low flyers out there, but then when we get over towards the Bristol Bay area, the Alaska Peninsula, icing is going to be up pretty high, so up above about 14,000 feet. Over the Panhandle with the showers down there, we will also look for at least some isolated moderate potential for icing, up above about 10,000 feet, however. Now a quick look at our jet stream, going to be steering that area of low pressure into the Bering Sea, so strongest winds are going to be on the south side of that area of low pressure, peaking out at about 130 knots over the southern Bering, and then those jet stream winds curve their way up into southwest mainland Alaska, then back down into the Gulf again. Now stepping down to 3,000 feet, strongest winds again on the south side of that area of low pressure, and at 9,000 feet, we do see winds peak out at about 60 knots just north of the Aleutian Chain there. That is the area that we're going to talk about for turbulence here in just a minute. Winds are weaker now when we get down to that 3,000 feet area, but still strongest winds out over the Bering Sea, south side of that low. Flying weather conditions across mainland Alaska going to be dominated by high pressure at the upper levels there and the mid levels, so we're not looking for much in the way of strong winds or turbulence for mainland. The area that we're going to be watching for turbulence tomorrow is going to be out along the Aleutian Chain, where we will look for some occasional moderate below about 4,000 feet and potential for isolated moderate stretching up into the Pribilofs.
What is an aurora? An aurora looks like a beautiful display of lights in the sky. These are some auroras that were spotted in the sky over central Alaska. We can also see auroras from space. This is what an aurora looks like from the International Space Station. The name of an aurora changes depending on its location. If you're in the northern hemisphere, it is called aurora borealis, or northern lights. And if you're in the southern hemisphere, then it is called aurora australis, or southern lights. So, what causes these beautiful displays of lights anyway? The sun. That's right. Even though auroras are best seen at night, these colorful displays are caused by our ever-changing sun. How exactly does it work? Well, the sun is constantly sending heat and light to Earth. It also sends other kinds of energy in small electrified particles, too. This is called the solar wind. Earth has a magnetic field, which protects us from most solar winds, but it also traps some of the electrified particles in the space around Earth. The sun does not always send the same amount of energy. Sometimes the sun has huge outbursts and blasts more stuff into space than the usual solar wind. These events are called solar storms. During one kind of solar storm, called a coronal mass ejection, the sun burps a massive bubble of gas that pops and sends particles and energy zooming through space. When a solar storm reaches Earth, it dances with our magnetic field, and some of the energy and particles that zip around the magnetic field dive into our atmosphere near the North and South poles. The particles then bump into gases in our atmosphere. These interactions result in displays of light in the sky, auroras. When the particles bump into oxygen in our atmosphere, the reaction makes green and red light. When the particles bump into nitrogen in our atmosphere, it makes blue and purple light. Earth is not the only planet with auroras. If a planet has an atmosphere and a magnetic field, it probably has auroras. For example, NASA spacecraft have captured amazing auroras on Jupiter and Saturn. Learn more about our planet and our solar system at NASA Space Place.
So the sun, looking here from the ground, seems very constant and quiet. But actually, when we look at it from space, we can see it's quite turbulent and active. Space weather is activity on the sun and in the near-Earth space that can affect our technological infrastructure and society. The sun is constantly spewing out a stream of particles called the solar wind that goes out into the solar system. And it affects us here near Earth, where we're protected by a magnetic field. The interaction between the solar wind and the magnetic field can cause space weather. The Carrington event is the largest storm we've seen in recorded history when we're looking at space weather. But every solar cycle, which repeats about every 11 years, one estimate estimates that there's a 10% chance of getting a large storm like the Carrington event that could impact us here on Earth. But we see solar storms almost all the time. And these storms have an effect on our technological infrastructure. Solar storms can cause activity in Earth's atmosphere and magnetosphere that can damage electrical power grids that power our communities, interrupt radio and satellite communications, and can cause our GPS navigation to fail. NOAA is working with its international partners to ensure that we have different vantage points where we can observe space weather. Our space weather observing infrastructure from space includes the NOAA Discover satellite and the NASA ACE satellite that are stationed upstream of Earth to give us a first buoy measurement of the solar wind. It also includes the ESA-NASA SOHO satellite and the NASA Stereo satellite that image the sun and also make coronagraph measurements of the outer atmosphere of the sun, the corona, that can tell us when large explosions happen off the sun. We also observe the sun and the Earth's magnetic field from the geostationary location with NOAA's GOES. So the way we use the space weather information from satellites and from the ground is to be able to make forecasts and predictions, just like we do with hurricanes and terrestrial weather. We observe the sun and look for activity and see how it develops. and see if it's going to culminate into a large explosion that can affect us here on Earth. NOAA is working with its international partners to expand our observing capability. We're committed to observing along the Sun-Earth line. So we're going to do the imaging of the sun and the upstream buoy measurements of the solar wind along the Sun-Earth axis. The more we understand about the sun, the more we can prepare for it and become, just like we are a weather-ready nation, become a space weather-ready nation. And as we look forward to humans exploring out into the solar system and advancing our space commerce activities, space weather becomes more and more important.
Here at the Space Weather Prediction Center, we monitor space activity as it's occurring back at the sun, and then we issue out a forecast as well as alerts, watches, and warnings as activity is occurring. A typical space weather event would start with a solar flare back at the sun. That solar flare is short-lived and produces fairly short-lived impacts as well, basically impacting communications on the daylit side of the Earth. However, some solar flares are also associated with a coronal mass ejection, or an eruption of plasma that's blasted off the sun and out into space. As forecasters, it's our job to determine if that cloud of plasma is moving towards Earth, and if it comes towards Earth, what the potential impacts may be. Those impacts can range from a fairly low-level storm that may produce the aurora a little bit farther south than usual, or can range up into fairly significant magnetic disturbances that don't happen very often, but when they do, they can impact technologies and infrastructure here on Earth. We provide information to lots of different user groups, from airlines to the electric power grid, to emergency managers, aviation, satellite community, lots of different customers.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Welcome back from the break, and moving on to marine weather now. We start by taking a look at the sea ice edge up over the Beaufort and Chukchi Seas up in the Arctic there. We do still have a little bit of ice holding on close to the coast over the Beaufort Sea there. Most of it there around Nuiqsut over towards Dead Horse, and we are continuing to see some melting as we go through the days ahead with that particular bit of ice. Getting close to seeing the Northwest Passage open up for the short season that it does so, but we're not quite there just yet. So we are still about 6 weeks off from the sea ice minimum that usually occurs over the Arctic in the middle of September, so we are going to continue to lose ice as we go through the weeks ahead. Are looking though at ice-free areas along the Chukchi Sea coast, essentially AKwx to the southwest there. Now for the marine weather conditions across southeast Alaska for the day on Wednesday, pretty benign conditions, not really expecting much in the way of impactful winds or waves tomorrow. For southeast interior channels, winds up to about 10 knots most places, a bit variable in direction, seas down around 2 feet. Also looking for some variability in our winds out over the Gulf of Alaska, there along the coast there, up to about 10 knots for our wind, 15 knots just offshore of Prince of Wales Island, and then seas still in the single digits though, 6 or 7 feet. Not much change for the day on Thursday. Again, benign weather down here, just some shower activity. That's going to be the main feature. But winds stay under 15 knots most places, and again, seas stay well down into the single digits. Now for Wednesday across south central Alaska, we start by looking over towards Prince William Sound, where we've got an offshore flow that's going to make for some pretty nice conditions with seas between 3 and 6 feet. Certainly going to be less less as you get closer into Prince William Sound, a bit more as you get out towards Resurrection Bay. But winds out of the northwest, so that's a pretty dry flow, and up to about 15 knots over Cook Inlet, winds up to about 10 knots, and then 2 to 3 feet for the seas there. On Thursday, we do see the wind pick up a bit over the Cook Inlet area, up to about 20 knots. Seas also picking up a little bit, up to about 6 feet there in the center part of Cook Inlet. And then we see the wind shift to be primarily out of the south, out along the eastern part of the Kenai Peninsula, and seas up to about 7 feet, winds to about 15 knots. Further out along the Alaska Peninsula for the day on Wednesday, definitely some variability in the direction here. On the Bering side, winds primarily out of the south, up to about 20 knots. The further west you go, 10 knots in Bristol Bay, and then 20 knots around Kodiak Island, seas up to about 6 feet. Now for the day on Thursday, that area of low pressure we've talked about several times today gets closer to the coast, so we are going to see some increases in both our winds and our waves for this particular region here, up to about 25 knots for the winds down along the Alaska Peninsula with the southwest flow, and then we'll see seas get up to about 10 feet. Further offshore towards the Pribilofs, you're going to see seas increasing a bit more than the 10 that you see plotted on the map here. On the Peck side, though, the seas aren't going to be quite as high, up to about 10 feet near Kodiak Island, winds up to about 25 knots for the day on Thursday. Further out the chain for the day on Wednesday, you can find that center of the low when you look at the wave field here, but closer to land areas, we're going to look for the waves to stay fairly manageable, up to about 11 feet out towards Shemya and Kiska, 12 feet as you get just a little bit closer to Adak there. Pretty gusty winds, 35 knots in between Kiska and Adak, and definitely going to have stronger winds further offshore into the Bering Sea. Now that area of strongest winds and waves moves off towards mainland as we get into the day on Thursday, so a lot of lessening for both our winds and our waves way out along the Aleutian chain for the day on Thursday. Up along the west coast, some variability in our wind direction for Wednesday, but primarily an offshore flow ahead of that frontal boundary that's working its way towards that area. So winds ranging from 15 knots up towards St. Lawrence Island to 30 knots as you get closer to the low, even more as you kind of get into the core of that low there. And then seas primarily in the 5 to 6 foot range, but again, as you get further out into the Bering, we'll see higher seas. Now everything picks up for the day on Thursday with that area of low pressure moving its way into this region here, variability in our wind direction, but a lot of onshore flow for the day on Thursday, and then winds ranging between 15 and 25 knots most places along the coast. Certainly could see some gusts a bit higher. Fairly benign conditions up along the Arctic coast for the day on Wednesday, where we do see some winds between 10 and 15 knots. And then in our ice-free waters, seas between 2 and 3 feet. Seas just a bit higher, but not much, down around Kotzebue Sound, 4 to 5 for the feet there. And then winds out of the south between 20 and 25 knots.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.